Welcome, everyone. It's really good to see the people who were here last time and the people who are new, and anyone else who's on the, just not video, but participating, welcome. I'm really so pleased that you're joining for this. It's a topic that really is very important to me as someone who cares a great deal about the condition of our incarcerated sisters and brothers around the country, and is committed in particular, among other things, to forging connections between what I call the incarcerated community and the non-incarcerated community, so that the one is not invisible to the other, and that the people who are non-incarcerated can actually hear the voices and learn from people who are incarcerated. Today we're going to look at, last time we looked at issues of punishment and what it is when we punish and sentence and convict people, how we treat them, as how our Jewish tradition can remind us to be conscious of the dignity of all human beings, even those who have committed crimes, even heinous crimes, to remind ourselves that that is an important element of our tradition. Today we're going to look at a slightly different topic. It's related, but incarceration itself. And the Jewish tradition doesn't have much to say about incarceration, because in the history of the Jewish people until the state of Israel, Jews weren't responsible for incarceration. Crimes that required that were handled over to the secular state, and in the biblical tradition, incarceration isn't an element. But what I am going to draw upon is the Irmaklot, the cities of refuge, which I think provide us a way of thinking about incarceration, even though the circumstances that someone goes into an Irmaklot, the city of refuge, differ from the situations that put people in prison and jails in our country today. I'm going to share the screen now with the document that I'll be working from. And I think at some point when we're sure that everybody's in here, Julia is going to also upload it in the chat box. So you can follow along if I'm going too fast, or you can just go at your own pace. So what I want to start with is this question of incarceration here in the United States. And one of the things that many people don't realize is how much of our incarceration system is a function of, or is a product of slavery. And that's true of policing as well, but our prison system and our policing systems evolved out of the controls that were put in place to monitor slaves, to catch slaves who escaped slavery. And then in the post-war period, a lot of the efforts to control the recently released formerly enslaved people were done through the criminal system, laws against loitering and so forth, which re-enslave people. And the way that they were re-enslaved is through the 13th Amendment, which actually has, as you can read it here, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That clause in the middle between the commas is really crucial. Except as a punishment for crime, wherein the party shall have been duly convicted. That condition is defined constitutionally as an opportunity for enslavement. People may be enslaved. And as we will look at the next document, which looks at, it's an excerpt from an article about penal plantation labor. Many of the prisons in the South in particular, where this practice evolved most rapidly, were basically taken over from plantations that had been agricultural farms with enslaved workers, and they were repurposed for prisons. And so even though the definition of the people working was now convicted labor or something like that, and we have the convict labor as a whole, another element of the post-war era, it's really worth noting that that slavery and prisons were directly related to one another. So what did that mean? This quote is I'm going to go through parts of this quote because it's very complex. And so again, I'm glad you'll have the copy of it to look at later. I'll read it and then point out the things I want to emphasize. So historically, the term slavery and involuntary servitude were not synonymous, because even from the beginning of colonization, there was a difference in the status between the two terms. That is to say, involuntary servitude would be indentured servitude. It was usually of a finite period with slightly different rules for the management and the control over the person who was in servitude. Slavery had broader avenues for control for the part of the slaver. The language of the 13th Amendment was borrowed from prior federal enactments and therefore is not much of a matter of great debate prior to adoption. The key difference between slavery and involuntary servitude is the social death of the unwilling laborer. And this is the really important point I want to emphasize. The idea of social death, because what we have in our prison system now, even though the people who are incarcerated are not dead, they are in a way made socially dead from the perspective of the non-incarcerated community. And in many cases, their experience there is akin to what is this term social death. So the scholar who is quoted in this article, Orlando Patterson, has argued that slavery is unique in its imposition of social death. Based on a comparative study of over 180 separate slave societies around the world, Patterson argues that a distinguishing characteristic of slavery, as compared to other forms of forced labor, is the social death of slaves. Social death is, and this is the important part, the alienation or exclusion of the slave from the community at large, justified by the general unworthiness of the slave. Social death may be accomplished through law, such as through lack of legal recognition of a slave's genealogical relationships, but it may also be accomplished through repetitive practices, rituals, and symbols denoting the unworthiness and ultimately social banishment. Now, when you listen to those, read those things again, you can see the resonances with our carceral system. The way that we exclude the person from society, we alienate them from our community, we consider them in some ways unworthy, not deserving of the same kinds of rights and even basic needs being addressed. They don't deserve the same amount. In a lot of the eyes of many people, incarcerated people are considered unworthy of basic needs. And then in the context of the work that's done in prisons, a lot of the descriptions that are associated with slavery are present as well. The idea that the work is often done through repetitive labor, it's not compensated. People who are incarcerated are paid anything from as low as $1 a day for work that they do, even in dangerous work like fighting fires in California last year and this year. And and also the practice rituals and symbols denoting unworthiness, which is part of that social death too. Our carceral system sets up rituals and patterns that tell the people who are incarcerated and tell the people who are not incarcerated that the incarcerated people are less, are unworthy, are different. Their clothing, their place of living, how they are identified by correctional officers, how they were spoken to. All of these things reinforce the idea that the person who is incarcerated has somehow been demoted in his or her human status. So anyway, the rest of the excerpt is important, but I'm going to, just because this is such a short class, I'm going to go past it. But I urge you to please read this paragraph because it really is an interesting, even though it's focusing on the agricultural prisons of the South, so much of the language that is used to describe the psychological consequences of incarceration are present here. And those psychological consequences are akin to a lot of the ways that enslaved people were demeaned and dehumanized. And even over the course of time, often assumed that same identity upon themselves. Like they accepted it because it was so reinforced through rituals, through symbols and so forth, that repeated to them on a daily and hourly basis that they were less than the people who were enslaving them. We also have examples of what incarceration looks like in our prisons. These are a few selections from people who work with an organization that I work with called Just Leadership USA. And it has a program called Leading with Conviction, which is a program to develop leadership from people who are formerly incarcerated. So people who have been convicted, it's a nice play on the word of conviction. And they give us some examples of what it's like in the facilities that they left. In the first one, I immediately, from day one, looked around and saw a list of things that were just horrific injustices, from leaving sanitary pads on the floor, like the women were animals, to mice, to no soap, which to me was just, are you kidding me? Everybody needs to wash their hands after using the restroom, but we're women on top of that. Toilets overwhelmed the septic system. I knew that there were things that were not fair, that they should be not be price gouging incarcerated people to use the telephone, that a prison shouldn't be getting kickbacks for it. So there were those kinds of just basic human dignity things. I wasn't going to stand for it. I didn't want to be treated like this. You don't treat human beings like this. A second one. Actually, I'm going to jump because I do want to get to our Jewish texts. The third one. For many who were not exposed to meaningful education as children, education in and after prison provided a crucial step towards claiming an identity of someone with the capacity to make a positive contribution and catalyze significant change. One of the leaders of Conviction described how education enabled her, sorry for the typo, to transcend the label criminal assigned to her in prison, setting in motion a process that shifted her identity to student and ultimately to leading expert on education and criminal justice policy. This quote from number 3 shows us the alternative ways that we might think about people who are incarcerated. It isn't essential that people who are in prison be degraded. It isn't essential that people who are in prison be subject to unsanitary conditions and limited access to basic necessities. And yet that seems to have been kind of the norm in our prisons, and often it's not really examined or even evaluated in terms of what human beings deserve. A lot of this comes from the opening perspective, which basically sees prisons as a place for people who are subhuman. And so if they're subhuman, they don't deserve what full human beings need. How might we think about this differently? Our tradition, as you may know, has this concept called the Maklot, the cities of refuge. In the biblical tradition, what they are for is for a person who commits involuntary manslaughter. And the idea comes from the notion of blood guilt, that when someone has spilled the blood of another person's family member to sort of rectify the cosmic imbalance, that blood has to be avenged by blood. And the Bible our Bible recognizes that imbalance can continue with blood feuds going on for generations. So there has to be a way to acknowledge that blood was shed without inciting the relative of the person who was killed to committing the violence and yet shedding more blood. So for involuntary manslaughter, this is what is the solution. The person is supposed to go to a city of refuge and remain there until the high priest dies. While in that city of refuge, that person is protected, and any of the blood avengers are unable to pursue that person. If the person leaves the city, then it's open game. And if there's a blood avenger, the blood avenger can pursue the person. Okay, that's the basic idea of the Maklot. Again, it's for involuntary manslaughter. But the rabbis ask, what should these things look like? What does this Maklot look like? And it gives us some categories, some suggestions. In the Gemara of the Babylonian Talmud Makot, these cities, one does not establish them in small settlements or large cities, rather in medium-sized towns. And one only establishes them in places where there is water. And if there is no water, then one must bring water to it. And one only establishes them in a place where there are markets. And one establishes them in a populated place. If the population decreases, one must add to it. And if the number of residents decreases, one must bring priests, Levites, and Israelites to it. What does this have to say to us? So it gives us a lot of criteria which give us perhaps the understanding of what the rabbis had in mind when they thought about these cities. They're not going to be in small villages, in isolated, faraway, remote places. They're also not going to be in dense cities where perhaps they can be not as well cared for, but in medium-sized towns where people will know the people in the town. They'll be part of a community. So it's a city, the person who is sent away has to be sent to a place that's a medium-sized town where there's enough infrastructure to make a viable living place. Obviously, it has to be in a place where there's water because water is essential to a sanitary and healthy life. And in a place where there's markets, which is fascinating to me because it implies that the city, that the place of incarceration has to have a place for livelihood. It has to actually replicate the world at large, the non-incarcerated society. There should be the same kind of activity that we find in our cities of non-incarceration should be available in incarcerated locations. It should be in a populated place. It should not be solely a population of just people who have fled because they've committed involuntary manslaughter. It has to have a diverse population. It has to have a population that consists of all the elements of society. Biblically, that seems to be priests, Levites, and Israelites, because that's one of the ways that our tradition broke down the population. In our world, we can say it means there should be a diverse population there. There shouldn't be just people who are incarcerated, but a community of people, incarcerated and non-incarcerated, people who are actors, people who are doctors, people who are farmers, whatever. And if those populations start to diminish, then there should be encouragement to make the community still remain diverse. So that's the first thing that really strikes me. And in many ways, it parallels some of the ways that incarceration is carried out in some of the few but very enlightened places that do differently in Europe, in Germany, and in Norway, not universally, but there are systems that are replicating this idea where the places of incarceration are communities. The officers who are involved with corrections, the correctional guards, we would call them in our country, and the people who are incarcerated live together. The people who are incarcerated go to jobs and then come back. They have keys to their homes. They make meals together. Sometimes the incarcerated people and the non-incarcerated people eat together. This is a model that exists outside of this country and is something we might turn to. And it seems to be kind of what our Gemara has in mind. The next thing is also rather interesting. So in Mishnah Torah Nizkim, this is the Rambam's teachings, he also describes what else does a person need besides the physical environment and the kind of urban necessities. We need something else. If a student was banished to a city of refuge, his rabbi is banished with him, as it is written, and he shall live, to make it possible for him to live. For one who is wise and desires wisdom, life without the study of Torah is like death. So too, if the rabbi is exiled, his students are exiled with him. So this is charming in a way, because of course it's charming that the rabbis imagine that the only way you could be happy is to study Torah. So obviously if you're going to be exiled, you have to have the means to study Torah. So what do you need? You need your rabbi, you need your teacher. But if your teacher goes, then the entire yeshiva has to go, because otherwise they would be left bereft without their teacher. So suddenly we have this picture of a person who's banished being accompanied by his or her community. And that the community is going to form a stable community in the place of banishment. I'm going to skip the next one because this next thing is actually really quite interesting, and I do want to save time for questions. So this is a modern commentator who reflects on the teachings of the Irmaklot. This Talmud takes this fairly straightforward law into unforeseen territory. The Bible says in Deuteronomy chapter 4:42, where the matter is reviewed, sorry, we get another typo, that a person guilty of negligent homicide can flee to a city of refuge and live. The Talmudic rabbis ask what it means to live. Obviously, he goes there to live and not die. And that is the purpose of the law. To live must mean something else. The rabbis decided that a person cannot live without the study of Torah. So if a person is exiled to the city of refuge, his teacher must go with him, and where the teacher goes, the whole yeshiva goes. The reading is, of course, contested, and there is no recorded case of a rabbi in the yeshiva following a negligent killer into the city of refuge. The Talmud is probably referring to something deeper. What is deeper? What is the deeper thing here? Something that every real parent, teacher, healer, therapist, life coach, mentor, true friend knows. You can only guide another person if you are willing to go into the exile experienced by the person for whom you are caring. The true witness to the suffering of another will not be untouched. Perhaps this is the mark of a healing process, whether family, friend, or counselor, the willingness to suffer some of the exile of the one in pain. The rabbi of the man who kills negligently must go into exile with him, we are taught, as well as the entire yeshiva. I try to imagine how the curriculum changes as the students who are now mostly those guilty of the negligent homicide. There's a lot to unpack in this passage. And I want to start, first of all, with the idea of people going with those who have committed a crime. The idea that instead of isolating someone, that we recognize that part of what is involved in rehabilitation and restoring someone to enable that person to return to society is a healing process. And a healing process can't happen in isolation from the community. The idea that people need to be in settings which are nurturing and supportive in order to heal and to become restored and to be rehabilitated. But the other part that I also find fascinating is that last sentence. I try to imagine how the curriculum changes. The idea that if people who are non-incarcerated actively engage with and are in proximity with, not close proximity, but in interaction with people who are incarcerated, think how differently we might carry out how incarceration might take place. If people who are in charge of running programs for incarcerated people, if people who are guarding or whatever they're doing are also accompanied by people who are there as witnesses, as caretakers, how might that alter the way that the structures are set up? And also the other part that strikes me is this emphasis that the biblical text has, that the Talmud picks up on, that this author picks up on, this Rabbi Mordecai Finley picks up on, is the emphasis on to live. That the idea of being exiled does not mean death, and it doesn't mean certainly the social death that our prison system seems to impose upon people while they're incarcerated. Rather, it should be a place to live. Even if you've committed a crime, there still is the opportunity to live, and by living, we learn, we can be instructed, we can also grow. And the concepts that our tradition teaches us sees exile not as a place of death, not as a place of deprivation, but as a place of growth, of learning, of nurturing, of healing, so that when the person re-enters, biblically that would be at the death of the high priest, but in our tradition, in our modern case, it would be at the end of a sentence, that person is ready to return, as opposed to being fully estranged from society, being part of society. Instead of being untrained in any kind of livelihood, having carried out that livelihood while incarcerated. Instead of having been deprived of education, being educated. If these things happen in an incarcerated context, I think we would see a tremendous difference in the experience of people when they return into the mainstream society. And if we thought about incarceration as not being something that was shunted off into the hinterlands, into the upper Hudson Valley in our state right now, or places that are somewhat remote from major cities, but rather in close enough proximity that we can visit and interact with people who are incarcerated, the humanity of those people would be much more evident to us, as opposed to them being fictional characters who are becoming like fictional characters who can take on whatever horrible traits we want to impose upon them. So I think in that sense, our tradition offers us a new model, a new way of thinking about how we interact with people who are incarcerated, how we think about the carceral structures themselves, and the expectations of what people who are incarcerated deserve and are entitled to. I'm going to now pause for a second to go send my final exam off, and I'll return and we can discuss this and take more questions. So just give me 1 minute.
Great. In the meantime, if folks want to put their questions or their comments in the chat box, now would be a good time, and then we can look at them in a minute.
I gotta get this thing. Oops, what happened? Oopsie, what happened? Here we go. Whoops. Okay, that's what I was going to. Okay. If you could just mute me for a second while I'm muttering, I would appreciate that.
Oh yeah, no problem. Got it. You're muted. Oh, and I'm also going to, I know a few people joined after I posted the video. I posted the link to the video from yesterday's class. If you missed yesterday's class, just find that in the chat box. Here we go. Okay, so here is the link to yesterday's class, the recording. So feel free to check that out. Oh, that's an interesting question, Beryl. I'm curious to hear the answer to that. Oh, also, in the meantime, while we're waiting, I wanted to let everyone know there's a class tomorrow. There's a bunch of upcoming classes, but I'll highlight a couple. Tomorrow is the third in a series on death and mourning rituals, and the teachers are covering green burial, which should be very interesting. And on Friday and every Friday, there is group Torah study at 10:30 a.m. Oh, sorry, I didn't say the time of the first class. So tomorrow, that's at noon Eastern. And on Friday morning, 10:30 Eastern time, is group Torah study. That's every week with rotating teachers. You can find all the links on myjewishlearning.com website. And also Friday afternoon is the third in a series called Mitzvah and Mysticism. That's at 2 p.m. Eastern. Okay, and
Yeah,
we're back in action.
I apologize for that. Apparently I had to do the whole thing over again because I had it all set up, but I was shut out of my Fordham thing. Anyway.
Yeah, no worries. Technology.
Happy to questions, yes.
So yeah, so there's one question, it's a very interesting question from Beryl. So those who were sentenced to the Makot, the cities of refuge by the rabbi, were they free to leave at their own peril?
That's an interesting question. I believe that the case is that they are. I mean, the idea is that it's a form of protection. But yes, the protection only exists while they're in that city. If they are out, then they can be pursued by a blood avenger and presumably killed. Yeah.
And another question: how should we punish criminals if we do not isolate them?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I want to maybe throw it back to the asker. What is it about isolating that is that's a good option. Before I
let me see who the
I mean,
it's hard to see. Would you be able to stop the
share?
Yeah.
I thought I did.
I can see.
I thought I did. Let me see.
Oh, yeah, you're good. I don't know why I was still seeing it.
Okay.
Let's see who. Okay, the person doesn't want to.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, I don't know that answer to the question, honestly. I mean, again, my expertise is not, I mean, I have limited expertise in the area of criminal justice as it's carried out, but I would say that what I think though is that the isolation that we use pretty much across the board in this country isn't working. And it isn't working partly because it defines those people who are incarcerated as other in such a profound and comprehensive way that it makes it extremely difficult, if not absolutely impossible, to restore that person to the full community without an enormous amount of work that is important to do, but should not be it should not require that kind of extraordinary work to return someone. The idea that we take someone who has committed a crime and label them, isolate them, denigrate them, often abuse them during the period of time where they're incarcerated has enormous consequences on the psyche of that person and the trauma of that person. I know that for many people I talk to about who have been incarcerated, they speak of the trauma of that experience. And often that trauma is just kind of dismissed. Well, again, don't commit a crime if you don't want that trauma. And that doesn't address the fact that the trauma is so deep-seated that it makes it very, very difficult to regain one's sort of stability. But I would also put the moral question there is, why do we have to traumatize people? And isolation is traumatizing. I mean, think about how we are all existing right now in this COVID environment, how difficult it is. I am fortunate, I do not live alone. People who live alone, I mean, it's extremely unnerving and destabilizing. And the isolation of that people who are incarcerated experience, the distance from their family members who cannot visit them, the distance from a society that doesn't actually have any windows onto what's happening there. Often prisons, the prisons I've taught at, they're remote enough from communities that there's no community oversight. There's no opportunity for people to even observe like what's going on when people are outside. And that leaves them subject to whatever kind of treatment guards can carry out. Sometimes that can be benign and sometimes it can be quite cruel. So I think the isolation part, I don't see a value in it. And I guess, there may be science that explains why it is useful in certain times. I'm very leery of that. I'm actually involved right now in New York State. We're trying to halt solitary confinement. And one of the things that is of concern to me is that even in the language of bills that are being put forth about halting solitary confinement, there is this slippery slope language that says something along the lines of, we will not use solitary except for the most dire circumstances and for the least amount of time. And both of those terms, dire and least, and I'm paraphrasing, the actual language is probably something slightly different, but the idea is the same, allows for it puts a wedge in that limitation. What's the least amount of time? Is the least amount of time an hour? Is it a week? Is it 4 weeks? I mean, what's the most dire situation? Is it someone who is having a psychotic episode? Is it someone who has irritated a guard? Is it someone who is asking for privileges for the community that are not being given? So I think the problem is that solitary confinement is the most extreme version of isolation. It's extremely traumatizing, but actually the isolation of the entire incarcerated community, each prison, is also traumatic. So that's my answer there.
And I think those are all the questions. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to say a couple things just before I finish.
Yeah,
I kind of had to begin, the class is short and I'm used to longer formats, so I tend to think bigger. But I do want to go back to this notion of the social death, which I think is a concept that for me was very illuminating. The idea that the way that we incarcerate people is there's so much symbolism around it. There's so much symbolism and ritual around it that serves to denote those people who are incarcerated as other, as different, and therefore subject to a whole different set of criteria about what they deserve, how they should live, what kind of circumstances, what kind of conditions they should be in, what kind of opportunities they should have, what kind of rights they should have after their sentence is completed, and so on. And we don't tend to think about that very much when we think about incarceration, how much of it is symbolic and ritualistic. But those elements in many ways have the deepest and most lasting consequences, because that operates on our psyche in a way that we don't really think about. And this is, again, I said this last time, I think this is why it is so important to revise the language we use to speak about people who are in prison and jails, to not call them inmates, prisoners, convicts, felons, but to speak of people as incarcerated, because that's the situation they're in at that moment, and that should not define them for their entire life. And also to recognize that this concept of social death it's not just a psychological trauma, but it's also a form of degradation. And I think that, again, yesterday's teaching emphasized this, that no matter what someone has done, no one is the worst thing that they've ever done. Nobody is the worst thing they've ever done. My therapist likes to say we all were in a little bassinet and we were all very sweet and happy before any whatever trauma happened that made us the screwed up people we are. But even growing up, you know, no one is as bad as the worst thing they've done. And that means that everyone deserves a basic level of dignity and respect. And our system doesn't do that. Our system, in fact, says loud and clear, you are not deserving, you're no longer a human being, you're no longer part of our community. And that's why I feel like it is so important for us to rethink it. And I do believe that our Jewish tradition gives us some instruments to do that with. It's not an exact fit. It's not like we have actual language that helps us directly attack our system with rabbinic texts, but I think the ideals and the values and the way that our tradition speaks about people who have transgressed is helpful in us thinking about how we can respond to people who have transgressed, committed crimes, and to advocate for how our country can rethink incarceration and really make a difference in the lives of the many millions of people, the far too many people, millions of people who are in prison jails in this country. So with that, thank you.